I worked night shifts for 20 years, and my kids called it easy money, so one morning I quietly stopped paying for everything, and I did not say a word about it at the breakfast table. My daughter was scrolling through her phone sipping iced coffee. My son was half awake, complaining about being tired from staying up late, and I just sat there listening like I always did, like I had for years, while they slept through the nights I spent working under fluorescent lights, cleaning up after people they would never see. By noon that same day, my daughter called me, her voice sharp and confused. "Mom, my card was declined." I said nothing at first. I let the silence stretch just a little longer than comfortable. Then I asked which one. She paused, then said, "All of them." I nodded even though she could not see me, and said, "You should probably check your account." She hung up without saying thank you, without asking why. Just like that, the first crack appeared. My son came home later that afternoon, slamming the door harder than usual. He stood in the kitchen holding his phone like it had betrayed him. "The rent payment bounced," he said. I looked at him calmly and poured myself a glass of water. "That is strange," I said. He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "What is going on, Mom?" I set the glass down carefully and wiped my hands on a dish towel. "Nothing dramatic, nothing loud." I just said, "Maybe things are not as easy as you thought." That evening we sat down for dinner, the same table, the same plates, but the air felt different, heavier, slower. My daughter kept glancing at me. My son avoided eye contact. Finally, she said, "Are you trying to teach us something?" I looked at her, and for a moment I saw the little girl who used to wait up for me to come home at sunrise, who used to hug me even when I smelled like bleach and tired air. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I just said, "If it is easy, then come with me tonight." They both hesitated, not because they did not understand, but because somewhere deep down they already did. By 9:30 p.m., I was putting on my shoes, the same worn pair I had used for years, the same routine I had followed through birthdays, holidays, and nights. When I was too tired to think, my daughter stood in the hallway, arms crossed. My son leaned against the wall, trying to act like it was no big deal. I grabbed my keys and opened the door. The night air was cool, quiet, the kind of quiet most people only know when they are asleep. I stepped outside and did not look back. Right away, I knew they would follow, and after a few seconds I heard it. The soft shuffle of footsteps behind me, hesitant, uncertain, real. For the first time in a long time, I was not the only one walking into the night. The drive across town felt longer than usual, even though the streets were mostly empty. The traffic lights changed without resistance. The city moved in slow, quiet patterns that most people never noticed. My daughter sat in the back seat, looking out the window, her reflection faint against the glass. My son kept checking his phone like it might suddenly fix everything that had gone wrong earlier. Neither of them spoke much, and I did not fill the silence. I had learned a long time ago that silence could say more than any explanation ever could. We pulled into the hospital parking lot just before 10:30. The building stood there, glowing under harsh white lights like it always did, steady, dependable, never sleeping. I parked in the same spot I had used for years and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet made them both shift uncomfortably. "This is where you work?" my son asked, his voice softer than before. I nodded and reached for my bag, the same bag I carried every night. Nothing fancy, just worn fabric and a zipper that sometimes stuck. I stepped out, and they followed, slower this time. The automatic doors opened with a low mechanical sound, and the air inside smelled clean, but not in a comforting way, more like chemicals and effort, the kind of clean that came from constant work, not from ease. We walked down the hallway, the floors polished, but already marked by footsteps, the lights too bright for the hour. A nurse passed us, pushing a cart, her eyes tired but focused. She gave me a small nod, the kind people share when they understand each other. Without speaking, my daughter looked around, taking everything in, the sounds, the distant beeping, the quiet conversations, the rhythm of a place that never stopped. I handed them each a pair of simple gloves, nothing complicated, just something to protect their hands. "Tonight," I said, "you stay with me, no shortcuts, no breaks unless I take one." They nodded, unsure, but no longer dismissive. We started in one of the smaller rooms, empty for now, but still needing to be cleaned. I moved the way I always did, steady, practiced every motion having a purpose. I wiped surfaces, changed liners, checked corners, places people rarely thought about. My son tried to follow at first, but he hesitated, unsure of where to begin. My daughter watched me closely, then started copying my movements, slower, less confident. The clock on the wall moved quietly, each minute stretching longer than it would during the day. By midnight, their energy had already begun to shift. My son leaned against the wall for a moment, rubbing his hands together like they were sore. My daughter asked how much longer. I looked at her and said the same thing I had told myself for years: "We are just getting started." They did not laugh this time. They did not say anything at all. We Moved into another room. This one recently used the air heavier, the work more detailed. I showed them what needed to be done, not rushing, not explaining too much, just letting them see it for themselves. My daughter stepped back at one point, her face tight, not from fear, but from realization. My son kept working, but slower, now more careful, as if he was beginning to understand that every small detail mattered. The hours passed differently for them. I could see it in the way they checked the clock, in the way their shoulders dropped, in the way their voices became quieter. By 2 in the morning, the building felt even larger, the hallways longer, the silence deeper. I kept moving, because that was what I had always done, but behind me I could hear their steps, less steady, no longer casual, no longer certain, and for the first time since they were children, following me into a place they did not understand. They were not leading their own world anymore. They were walking inside mine. By 3 in the morning, the hospital had settled into a different kind of quiet, not silence, but a steady low hum, machines breathing for people, lights flickering softly, footsteps echoing farther than they should. My daughter sat on the edge of a chair for a moment, her shoulders slumped, her hands resting in her lap, like she had forgotten what to do next. My son stood near the doorway, staring at the floor like it might give him an answer he had never needed before. I kept moving, not faster, not slower, just the same pace I had learned over the years, because the work did not stop just because you were tired. It did not care how you felt, it only cared that it was done. We entered another room, and I handed them fresh supplies. My son took them this time without hesitation, but his grip was tighter, like he understood now that this was not just something you watched, this was something you carried. My daughter followed behind me, her steps slower, her eyes more focused. She was no longer looking around out of curiosity, she was watching every movement I made, as if trying to understand how something so repetitive could still require so much attention. I wiped down a surface and stepped aside, letting them take over. My son started first, his motions unsure, but determined. He missed a spot, then went back to fix it. My daughter picked up a cloth and worked more carefully, checking the corners, just like she had seen me do earlier. Neither of them spoke for a long time, and that silence felt different from before. It was not resistance anymore, it was effort. Around 4 in the morning, my son finally said, I did not know. His voice was quiet, not defensive, just tired. I did not answer right away. I finished what I was doing and placed the supplies back in their place. Before I looked at him, you were not supposed to know, I said. You were supposed to sleep. He nodded slowly, like the words settled somewhere deeper than he expected. My daughter leaned against the wall, her eyes slightly red, not from anything dramatic, just from exhaustion, from the weight of staying awake when your body had already given up. She looked at me and asked, how long have you been doing this like this? I thought about it, not in years, not in numbers, but in moments. Missed mornings, rushed nights, quiet dinners, eaten alone longer than you have noticed, I said. She lowered her gaze. After that, we moved into the hallway again. The floors still needed attention, the routine still the same, but now they followed closer, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Somewhere between the hours and the repetition, something had shifted in the way they walked, in the way they carried themselves, in the way they looked at the work. By 5, the sky outside had started to lighten, just barely, a thin line of gray pushing against the darkness. The hospital began to change again, the early staff arriving, voices picking up pace, the night slowly handing itself over to the day. My son stretched his back, slowly wincing, not dramatically, just enough to show that his body had reached a limit. My daughter rubbed her hands together quietly, her energy almost gone. We finished the last room without rushing, without cutting corners, because that was how it had always been done. When we stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, lighter, the kind of air people usually associate with rest, but for me it had always meant the end of something else. They stood there beside me, not speaking, not checking their phones, not rushing to leave, just standing in a moment they had never shared before, and for the first time they were not asking questions, they were understanding. We stood in the parking lot for a few seconds longer than necessary, the early morning light soft but unforgiving, revealing details people usually ignore. My daughter wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from something else, something quieter. My son looked out across the empty rows of cars, his posture different from the night before, less certain, less sure of what came next. I unlocked the car and sat down without rushing. They followed, slowly closing the doors with a kind of care that had not been there before. The drive home was silent, not the same silence from earlier. This one had weight, it settled between us, not uncomfortable, just honest. My daughter rested her head against the window, her eyes half closed. My son leaned forward slightly, his hands together, as if trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. I kept my eyes on the road, the same streets we had driven through hours before, now filled with early commuters, people starting their day while ours was ending. When we pulled into the driveway, the sun had fully risen. The house looked the same as always, quiet, familiar, unchanged, but something inside it had shifted. We walked in together, no one speaking, no television, no music, just the sound of footsteps and the soft hum of the refrigerator. My daughter sat down at the kitchen table without reaching for her phone. My son stood there for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat across from her, both of them waiting not for answers, but for something they had not yet learned how to say. I set my bag down in the same place I always did and washed my hands slowly, the routine grounding me in a way words never could. When I turned around, they were still there, still quiet. My daughter finally looked up at me, her voice low. How do you do it every night? I dried my hands and folded the towel carefully. I do not think about the whole night, I said. I think about the next thing that needs to be done. She nodded slowly, like she was trying to understand a language she had never needed before. My son spoke next, his voice steady, but softer than I had ever heard it. I did not realize how much it takes. I met his eyes for a moment, not long enough to make him uncomfortable, but long enough for him to see that I had heard him. Then I walked to the drawer and pulled out a small stack of papers, nothing dramatic, just numbers, hours, paychecks, bills. I placed them on the table between us, not pushing them forward, just letting them sit there. This is what it looks like, I said quietly. They both leaned in closer, not out of curiosity this time, but out of respect. My daughter traced a line of numbers with her finger. My son exhaled slowly, like the weight of it all had finally found its place. No one said the word easy again, and I did not need them to. The house remained quiet, not empty, just still, like something had finally settled into truth after a long time of being ignored. I picked up my bag again and headed toward my room, not because I was leaving, but because I had done what needed to be done, and for the first time in years I did not feel like I had to explain anything at all. The house stayed quiet longer than usual that morning, not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that made every small sound stand out: the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint noise of a car passing outside. I lay down for a few hours like I always did after a shift, but sleep came differently this time, lighter, less heavy, as if something inside me had finally loosened. When I woke up, it was late afternoon, the sun coming through the blinds in thin lines across the wall. I could hear movement in the kitchen, not rushed, not careless, just steady. I stepped out slowly and saw my daughter standing at the counter reading something, her brow slightly furrowed. My son sat at the table with the papers I had left earlier spread out in front of him. He looked up when he noticed me, not startled, just aware, like he had been waiting for that moment. Neither of them spoke right away, and I did not interrupt the quiet. My daughter finally said, I did not know groceries cost this much. Her voice was not complaining, it was surprised. My son nodded and added, and the utilities. I did not realize how fast it adds up. I walked to the sink and poured myself a glass of water, letting them finish their thoughts without rushing them. That was always the part people skipped. Understanding did not come all at once, it came in small pieces. My daughter sat down slowly and looked at me, not like before, not dismissive, not distracted, just present. Why did you never tell us? She asked. I leaned against the counter and thought about that question longer than it needed. I did not want you to feel it, I said simply. I wanted you to have space to grow without carrying this too early. My son looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of one of the papers. You carried all of it by yourself, he said. I did not answer right away because the truth was not dramatic. It was not something that needed explanation. It was just what had to be done. I carried what was mine, I said quietly, and I did it because you needed it. The room stayed still after that, not tense, not uncomfortable, just different, like something had finally settled into its right place. My daughter stood up and began putting the papers back together, neatly stacking them instead of leaving them scattered. My son pushed his chair in slowly, something small but deliberate. They were not trying to fix everything, they were just beginning to see it, and that was enough for now. Later that evening, my daughter picked up her phone, but instead of scrolling, she opened a calculator. My son pulled out a notebook, writing numbers down, checking them twice, not out of panic, but out of responsibility. I watched them for a moment, then turned away, not because I was done, but because I no longer needed to stand there and prove anything. The house was the same, the walls, the furniture, the quiet, but the way they moved inside it had changed. They were no longer walking through a life that felt automatic. They were starting to see the weight behind it, piece by piece, hour by hour, just like I had for years. And for the first time, I could step back just a little and let them carry some of that understanding on their own. That evening moved slower than usual, not because there was nothing to do, but because everything felt more deliberate. My daughter stayed in the kitchen longer than she needed to, rinsing dishes, carefully drying them one by one instead of leaving them in the rack. My son sat at the table with his notebook, still open, numbers written across the page, some Crossed out some circled like he was trying to understand not just the totals, but how they came together. I did not interrupt them. I moved through the house the same way I always had, checking small things, closing cabinets, turning off lights that were not needed, habits built over years of stretching every dollar, making sure nothing was wasted. When I reached for my bag later that night, both of them noticed immediately, not with surprise, but with awareness. My daughter looked at the clock, then back at me. "You are going again?" she asked. I nodded and put on my shoes. The same steady motion, the same quiet routine. My son stood up this time, not hesitant like the night before, but not confident either, just present. "Do you do this every night?" he asked. I adjusted the strap on my bag and said, "Most nights." He let that answer sit for a moment, like he was measuring it against everything he had assumed before. My daughter stepped closer, her voice softer. "Can we come again?" I looked at her, not searching for the right answer, just listening to the question and what it carried. "You can," I said, "but you do not have to." She shook her head slowly. "We want to," she said, not quickly, not out of guilt, just clearly. I opened the door, and the night air met us again, familiar and unchanged, but this time the way they stepped outside was different. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a quiet understanding of what the night meant. The drive felt shorter, not because the distance had changed, but because the silence between us had settled into something steady. When we arrived, the hospital looked the same as always, lights steady, doors opening and closing, people moving through their own routines, but this time they did not look around like outsiders. My son walked beside me, matching my pace. My daughter stayed close, not watching everything, but focusing on what was in front of her. We started the same way we always did, supplies first, then the first room, then the next. No shortcuts, no rushing, but this time I did not need to show them where to begin. My son picked up what he needed and started working, checking his progress as he went. My daughter moved carefully, making sure she finished one task before starting another. They were slower than me, but that did not matter. They were present, and that was something they had never been before. By midnight, there were no complaints, no questions about how much longer, just quiet work, steady effort, the kind that builds understanding without needing words. When a nurse passed by and thanked us, my daughter nodded back, not surprised, not unsure, just acknowledging something she had not noticed before. My son paused for a second, watching the hallway, then went back to what he was doing without hesitation. The hours passed, and this time they did not seem to fight against them. They moved with them, adjusting slowly, learning what it meant to stay when your body wanted to leave. And as I watched them, I realized something had changed, not just in how they saw the work, but in how they saw themselves inside it. They were no longer standing outside of my life, trying to judge it. They were stepping into it piece by piece, carrying a small part of it with them without needing to be asked. By 2 in the morning, the rhythm of the place had settled again, but this time it did not feel overwhelming. It felt understood. My son moved ahead of me into the next room, not rushing, not hesitant, just steady. He checked the supplies before starting, something he had not done the first night. My daughter followed behind, finishing what he missed without saying anything. Their movements were not perfect, but they were intentional, and that made the difference. I stayed a step back, watching, not because I needed to correct them, but because I could finally let them find their own pace. A nurse passed by and paused for a moment, looking at the three of us together. She smiled slightly, not surprised, just noticing something she had not seen before. My daughter returned the smile quietly, then went back to her work without breaking her focus. My son wiped down a surface carefully, then went over it again, not because I told him to, but because he wanted to make sure it was right. The hours moved forward, and for the first time they did not seem to resist them. There was no checking the clock every few minutes, no quiet complaints, just the sound of work being done piece by piece. Around 3:30, my daughter stopped for a second and leaned against the counter, taking a slow breath. She did not say she was tired, but it was there in the way she stood. My son noticed and handed her a bottle of water without making it a big moment. She took it and nodded, then returned to what she was doing. Small things like that, changes that did not need to be explained. I moved into the hallway, and they followed without needing direction. The floors stretched out in front of us, long and quiet, the lights steady above us. My son looked down the hallway, then at me, and said, "It never really ends, does it?" I shook my head slightly. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, it just keeps going." He nodded once, not discouraged, just aware. My daughter added softly, "And you kept doing this even when we did not notice." I did not answer right away, because that part was not about being seen. It never had been. I did what needed to be done, I said simply, and that was enough for them to understand. We finished the last room before 5, the same way we had started, steady, complete, no shortcuts. When we stepped outside again, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clear. My Sun stretched slowly, then stood still looking at the sky like he had not seen it at this hour in years. My daughter stood beside him quiet, not reaching for her phone, not filling the moment with noise, just being there. After a few seconds my son spoke, his voice low. I think I understand now, not everything, but enough. I looked at him and nodded. That was all that mattered. My daughter turned to me and said, "You made it look easy." I met her eyes and said, "I never said it was easy." She shook her head slowly. "I know," she said. Now the drive home was different from before, not silent, but calm, the kind of calm that comes after something shifts into place. When we pulled into the driveway, neither of them rushed to get out of the car. They sat there for a moment like they were not quite ready to leave what they had just stepped into, and when we finally walked inside the house, it no longer felt like a place where things were simply given. It felt like a place where things were earned and understood, even in the quiet. The next few days did not return to the way they had been before. Not exactly. The house still looked the same from the outside, the same driveway, the same quiet street, but inside something had settled into a new rhythm. My daughter woke up earlier than usual one morning, not rushing, not complaining, just moving through the kitchen with purpose. She checked the refrigerator, made a list on a small piece of paper, and opened her laptop to compare prices, something she had never done before. My son spent more time at the table, his notebook open again, but this time not just looking at numbers. He started organizing them, separating what was needed from what could wait. His phone stayed face down more often, not because he was told to, but because he no longer needed the distraction. I watched from a distance, not stepping in, not correcting, just letting them move through it the way I had learned to over time. That evening, when I reached for my bag again, they both noticed, but neither of them asked to come this time. My daughter simply said, "Drive safe," and my son added, "We will take care of things here." I nodded once and stepped outside. The night air felt the same, but I did not feel like I was carrying everything alone anymore. When I returned in the morning, the house was quiet, but not in the old way. There was a note on the table, written in careful handwriting: groceries, planned meals, listed bills, organized. Nothing dramatic, just small signs that something had shifted into place. Later that day, my daughter sat across from me, her hands folded, not nervous, just thoughtful. "I applied for a second position," she said, "part-time, just to start." I looked at her and nodded, not because I expected it, but because I understood what it meant. My son spoke next. "I called about a job today, something steady," he said, not looking for approval, just sharing the fact. I listened without interrupting, because this was not about me anymore. This was about them stepping into something real. The evening passed quietly, no long conversations, no sudden changes, just small actions building on each other. My daughter began cooking more often, not perfectly, not efficiently, but with attention. My son started keeping track of expenses without being asked. Both of them moved through the house differently, not as if everything was provided, but as if everything had weight and meaning. One night, my daughter stood by the door as I prepared to leave. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "I used to think you just worked nights." I paused and looked at her. She continued, "I did not understand that you carried the day too." I held her gaze for a second, then said, "You do not have to understand all of it, just enough to respect it." She nodded slowly and stepped back. My son added quietly, "We do now." I did not respond, because they did not need a response. They had already reached the part that mattered. When I stepped outside again, the night felt familiar, but lighter, not because the work had changed, but because something inside the house had shifted into understanding. And for the first time in years, the weight of it all did not belong to just one person anymore. Weeks passed, and the changes did not fade. They settled into place quietly, the way real change does, not loud, not announced, just steady. My daughter began leaving the house earlier each morning, her bag packed, her steps more certain. She no longer asked where things came from. She had started learning how to build them herself. My son found work that kept him moving, not glamorous, not easy, but honest. He came home tired in a way that was different from before, not restless, not frustrated, just spent in a way that made sense. The house adjusted around them. Meals were planned, not assumed. Lights were turned off without reminders. Bills were handled without hesitation. Nothing dramatic, no sudden transformation, just a series of small choices made again and again. One evening, I came home earlier than usual, the sky still holding a soft blue. Before fading into night, I stepped inside and paused for a moment. The kitchen light was on. My daughter stood at the stove stirring something slowly. My son sat at the table reviewing a sheet of numbers. They both looked up when they heard the door, not surprised, just aware. My daughter smiled slightly and said, "Dinner is almost ready." My son nodded and added, "Everything is covered for the week." I set my bag down and took off my shoes. The same routine, but the feeling was different, not because the work had changed, but because I was no longer the only one holding it together. We sat down at the table and ate without rushing. No phones, no distractions, just the quiet sound of plates and small conversation. My daughter asked me about my shift. My son listened without interrupting, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to understand. After dinner, my daughter cleared the table without being asked. My son wiped down the counter, carefully checking the edges the way he had learned that night in the hospital. Small habits carried into a different space. I watched them for a moment, then stepped back into the living room, not because I was done, but because I could be later. That night, as I prepared to leave again, my daughter stood by the door and said, "We will be fine," my son added. "You do not have to worry." I looked at them both and nodded, not because I believed everything would be perfect, but because I knew they understood what it took. When I stepped outside, the night felt the same as it always had, steady, quiet, waiting, but I did not feel like I was walking into it alone anymore. When I returned the next morning, the house was still and calm, not empty, just resting. I moved through it slowly, noticing the small things that had changed: the list on the counter, the organized bills, the absence of carelessness, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to sit down without thinking about what needed to be done next. The clock moved quietly, the light shifted across the room, and I realized something simple, something clear. They no longer saw it as easy. They saw it for what it was: something that required time, effort, patience, something that carried weight and meaning, and they carried part of it now, not because they were told to, but because they chose to, and that made all the difference.